Okay, so today I wanted to discuss some evidence for an argument that I've made privately, but of course, will also have to present here. And my argument concerns how it's about historical development. So it concerns how citizens become citizens at all, how people gain recognition from a state or some polity. And I think my argument sort of attacks what I see as the illusion of the average person gaining rights or the idea of progress at all on those fronts, let's say, for now. And a lot of this argument has to do with warfare. So basically, as in the most simple terms I can come up with, my argument is that people gain their so-called rights or their so-called political recognition as a way to fully mobilize societies for war. And I think that there are just countless examples of this throughout history. And I want to make a couple of videos sort of going through that. So the first example I'm going to pull is ancient China, right? So we're going to start with two periods in ancient China, the spring and autumn period, which generally is thought to run from about 770 BC to roughly 476 BC. And then the period that follows will also come into play, what's known as the Warring States period. Now, before I start, getting into my specific example, I just want to point out that a lot of this argument is either taken directly from or certainly inspired by the philosopher, political scientist Bertrand de Jouvenel, a man of the sort of middle 20th century who was a lecturer and professor at various impressive institutions. And I just wanted to read a passage or maybe just a brief quote from his work on power, its nature, and the history of its growth. He said the following, quote, "If we arrange in chronological order the various wars which have for nearly 1,000 years ravaged our Western world, one thing must strike us forcibly, that with each one, there's been a steady rise in the coefficient of society's participation in it, and that the total war of today is only the logical end of an uninterrupted advance towards it, of the increasing growth of war," end quote. So I think what de Jouvenel is getting at there is that in the Western context, we can see this, in the wake of the fall of the Roman Empire's influence in Europe, we see these sort of feudal polities emerge with a much more decentralized form of government than we might be used to today. And over time, the need, sort of the inertia towards gaining power for the sake of putting a strong military in the field, that creates these larger and larger state formations and then nations as we properly know them later on. And eventually this is all heading towards what de Jouvenel was seeing in his time, which was these totalitarian states in Europe. And I think what de Jouvenel might argue, and what other thinkers like maybe James Burnham might argue, exist also in North America, right? A different kind of totalitarianism, but certainly the United States as a state was much more far-reaching and intrusive than anything you might have seen in the Middle Ages. What I want to do here is take de Jouvenel's point about Europe over the last 1,000 years and sort of look at other situations where you can find something very similar happening. And as I said, the first example we'll run with is the ancient Chinese context, beginning in the spring and autumn period. So during this spring and autumn period, roughly in the 700s BC, we see warfare being conducted on a pretty low level. I think it's like if you ever saw a 10,000-man army, that was really significant. But we'll see those numbers blow up in the coming centuries. I like historian John Keegan's use of the phrase chariot aristocrats to describe the charioteers that were essential to an army in China during the spring and autumn period. And just to give you some context of why that's important, if you need a chariot to participate in warfare, you have to be quite wealthy because, as one might maybe imagine, chariots in this time period were pretty expensive to come by and build. Robert Drews, the author of The Coming of the Greeks, Indo-European Conquest in the Aegean and the Near East, states that the first chariots were, quote, prestige vehicles and were, quote, made for kings and high officials. Now, he's talking mostly in the Indo-European context, but that applies for China as well. I think we have a quote coming up that discusses that. Now, the expense that went into creating these vehicles is obvious when you actually look at how this was done. Ralph Sawyer, in his book Ancient Chinese Warfare, gives us a rundown about what it took to create a chariot during this time period. Quote, fabricating a chariot required several highly particularized skills, a variety of natural resources, the observation of seasonal constraints, and ultimately the manufacture of hundreds of discrete components that had to be made closely compatible in order to be assembled. Molds had to be made, and bronze fixtures cast, glue prepared, leather tanned, treated, and cut to size, wood selected, seasoned, shaped, bent, and everything assembled by slotting and boring and shaping, lashing, gluing, mortising, and force fitting. It was such a time-consuming process that the Yi Qing employed it as an analogy for impossibility by speaking of, quote, bending the wood for a wheel in the morning and wanting to ride the chariot at night. According to John Keegan, the charioteer basically required an entire team to aid his vehicles and the horses that were necessary to use the chariot. He says, quote, an entourage of secondary specialists, grooms, saddlers, wheelwrights, joiners, fletchers, all were essential to keeping war chariots and horses on the road. End quote. Now, like any issue involving Chinese history, you'll find Chinese sources claiming chariot use in China as early as 2000 BC. This is certainly off by probably something like 1,000 years, at least in the military context. It's really during the spring and autumn period that we see the emergence of the chariot on the battlefield, and also the emergence of what I'm going to call aristocratic warfare. And I'm going to get into what I mean by aristocratic warfare soon. This period in Chinese history was essentially feudal in nature. Power was widely dispersed, kind of like I mentioned in the beginning when we were discussing what happened in Europe after the fall of Roman influence in Western Europe. Now, the various houses in China during the spring and autumn period that held control within this feudal system, those houses ran on hereditary lines. So power was tightly controlled within kinship networks, and basically various lords had loyalty from local soldiers who themselves came from the upper reaches in the Chinese society. And as a result of this, and probably a bit due to the technology involved in the chariot, we see sort of norms, or I hesitate to say laws of war, but at least norms of war that were highly ritualized in some way, and also just exude this sense of honor that the ancient Chinese warrior would bring to the field. And this can be found in many sources discussing this time period. What I'm talking about is evidence for this highly chivalric, aristocratic way of approaching war. So, for instance, author Hurley G. Creel, who wrote The Origins of Statecraft in China, he states that war during this period was, quote, ideally a game played between gentlemen. And we have some examples of this. So, for example, in 638 BCE, in a battle between the Chu and Sung states, the Sung refused to attack the enemy, even though they're sort of haphazardly forming ranks in front of them. And they specifically decided not to attack because it was thought to be an offense against the way honorable warfare was practiced, that you should really hit an enemy when he was strong and not try to take advantage of weak points or any type of disorder that's created. Creel also notes that prior to battles using chariots, quote, the ground was prepared by filling in wells and leveling holes made for cooking. So if you think you're going to sustain a chariot attack, maybe digging a trench might be like the obvious way to avoid that. But this was not only forbade, but they would actually fill in naturally occurring holes in order to make chariot use possible. Creel says that this would have violated the code of a true gentleman of the spring and autumn period. And Creel concludes that, quote, for chivalrous fighting between Chinese gentlemen in the spring and autumn period, the chariot was an excellent device. end quote. So as we can see, the tools of warfare have a lot to do with how war is conducted and who is participating in warfare. Of course, the masses of Chinese peasants can't all have their own chariot and team of horses and fletchers and joiners and all that stuff to keep them in the field. Now, there were certainly other rules at play too, and according to Stephen Neff, author of War and the Law of Nations, there was, quote, a tradition by which an army would discontinue a war when the ruler of the opposing side died. Neff also gives some credit to what I said earlier, that to attack an enemy at its strongest was considered noble rather than going after its weakest point. And going after its weakest point or exploiting the other army's weaknesses was considered ignoble. And to be honest, this is all rather unsurprising, that Chinese warfare during this time period was highly ceremonialized. That's something we're going to be getting into off the battlefield as well. That prior to battle, there were these very involved rituals that sort of sanctified the battlefield, that made the warriors' work sort of something almost religious, or maybe even overtly religious in some contexts. It's unsurprising because, you know, if you want to design a method of warfare to keep casualties down, well, this would be one way to do it, I think, is to not engage in wholesale slaughter, to sort of wait for armies to form, to quit the battle once the enemy's leader has died. This will sort of help keep the mechanisms of war from eating up too many people. And because aristocrats were fighting wars, it's very unsurprising that that was something that, you know, leadership in these state polities were concerned with. And this is something that comes up in Li Fang's work. The book I'm quoting from here is Early China, A Social and Cultural History. He says, quote, through much of the spring and autumn period, warfare was the privilege of the aristocrats who fought mainly from their chariots. Commoners sometimes fought in battles, but they did so normally as attachments to the charioteer, who were usually their lineage leaders. And then a little bit later, he says the following, quote, the maintenance of an army composed of a large number of horse-drawn war chariots was costly, and the bronze weapons they used in combat were hardly affordable to commoners. These factors had significantly limited the scale of war, which through most of the spring and autumn period remained an essentially aristocratic exercise. End quote. Mark Edward Lewis, who I believe is at Stanford, teaching various courses on Chinese history and philosophy, his book, which I'm going to quote from heavily going forward, Sanctioned Violence in Early China, that book lays out my argument, I think, in a couple ways, and I'm going to pull a quote from there that I think follows nicely from what Fang has just said. Lewis says the following, quote, during the 7th and 6th centuries BC, China was dominated by a warrior aristocracy whose privileged status was marked by its monopoly on ritually directed violence. Sanctioned killing in the forms of sacrifice, warfare, and hunting constituted the central rites of the cults of the ancestors and the state altars, and the performance of these rites set the aristocracy apart from the common people. End quote. Now, Lewis spends a good part of his work describing the ritualistic elements that the Chinese aristocracy of the spring and autumn period used to sort of sanctify warfare and violence of any sort, right? According to Lewis, the Chinese aristocracy of this point kind of looked at hunting and warfare almost as similar, if not the same act. While there are many different examples we could, go into to show what I mean here, I think it's maybe easy enough to note that prior to every battle, the aristocrats we're talking about who used chariots would, go to the temple, go to the altar, make sacrifices, and then at the end of the battle would go back and do so as well. So, the battle occurs between sort of these two religious acts and therefore can be considered as like almost a continuation of them. Lewis then goes on to describe just how exclusive participation in warfare was during this time period. Quote, those who participated in these services formed an elite which set itself apart from the general populace through its devotion to ritual performances. And this elite was in turn ranked as king, feudal lords, hereditary ministers, and nobles, according to kin ties defined in lineage law. And then a bit later, quote, This idea of a common nobility led to a proximity of status and a sharing of authority, which was radically different from the later imperial system. End quote. So we have this nobility that really sets itself apart from the common population and whose authority, is fairly leveled between each other, right? So it's more like the feudal era in Europe than once we get the domination of monarchs and something like a real nation state begins to emerge in Europe. And simultaneously with this, warfare was bound up in that aristocracy. And they decided to basically create these rules surrounding warfare, which kept the costs at least a bit down. Also considering the fact that the state was not yet, or the fiefdoms or the polities here, were not yet fully mobilized for warfare. It just didn't allow these armies to stay in the field very long, and you could only equip an army to a lower degree than what we'd see in the future, at least. So while the aristocrats were performing all of these rituals and participating in warfare, what were the peasants up to? The masses of people, basically, in China. Well, they were essentially absent from the battlefield, and also the political influence that came with participating in warfare. The Chinese, I guess, houses at this point really did not extend themselves too far into rural China, outside these city-states from which they operated. Even collecting taxes from this population was kind of loose, right? That practice was not so codified as it would become later on. According to historian Cho Yun-soo, probably butchering that pronunciation, but that's what I got. He is an expert on the spring and autumn period, and he describes a striking separation between the Gaoren, which are the people of the state or of the city, which included soldiers and their descendants, and the local political elite. There's a sharp separation between them and the population known as the Yeren, or the people of a field, who were essentially farmer peasants with no political standing, also no role to play in battle, and were, as I said, very lightly taxed. So that's basically how society was set up during the spring and autumn period. However, at least two factors will basically start breaking that social order down. And one of them was the emergence of the tea barbarians, who did not abide by these sort of aristocratic, chivalric norms of war. These tea barbarians showing up basically sort of forced the abandonment of the chariot to some degree. According to Creel, 3 years before the birth of Sun Tzu, in 451, there is an example of a Qin commander, quote, ordering his chariot fighters to turn themselves into infantry in order to meet a coalition of tea barbarians, end quote. And as Creel explains, this order was not taken well. At least one charioteer who was, quote, unwilling to suffer this loss of dignity resisted and was promptly executed, end quote. As Creel notes, against these new enemies, quote, it is hard to avoid the conclusion that, as a weapon, the war chariot must have been rather worse than useless, end quote. So the tea barbarians showing up sort of break the usefulness of the chariot. Now, of course, one other rule I think I forgot to mention earlier is that these Chinese houses would agree on a battlefield and agree on a time and place to meet. Well, the tea barbarians were not going to play by those rules. That had a significant effect on how useful a chariot could be, right? If you just picked a battlefield or refused to meet on a level surface and use that as a battlefield, well, your chariots are going to be, as Creel said, maybe worse than useless. Lewis, an author we've noted before, also discusses in detail the shift away from the chariot aristocratic warfare with these, sort of highly ritualized rules and observances in battle. He describes the change from this type of warfare to warfare that was going to be more common during the Warring States period to follow, which, interestingly, that's when Sun Tzu is writing. So, and we're going to bring that up too after we get this Lewis quote in here. Lewis says the following, quote, "These were called warring states because they devoted themselves to warfare. They were created through the progressive extension of military service, and the registration and mobilization of their populations for battle remained fundamental to their existence as states. They kept every form of violence that had defined the earlier political order: warfare, sacrifice, blood oaths, and vengeance. But these were reorganized and reinterpreted as constitutive elements of the new order. Whereas under the nobility, the actual performance of ritually sanctioned violence had been a hallmark of authority, in the warring states, all men engaged in licit violence, while authority was associated with its manipulation and control. Instead of being a means of defending honor, sanctioned violence served to establish or reinforce the authoritarian, hierarchical bonds that constituted the new social structure." End quote. So as we can see, according to Lewis, and as essential to my argument, during this new warring states period that follows the spring and autumn period, we see the mobilization of the state, and really what we're going to get into soon, the mobilization of the peasantry, in a way that I think is a little unhelpful to the peasantry because, during the spring and autumn period, they were free from the responsibility of going to battle. And even if they did go to battle during those time periods, it was rather limited in scale. But both of those things will change during the warring states period. The peasantry will now play a significant, if not essential, role in battle, and those battles will become much larger, deadlier, and more prolonged. And interestingly, the weapons change as well. We already talked about how the chariots were kind of going out of style because of the T-barbarians. Well, they're also going out of style because eventually some of these local lords realized that if you conscript the peasantry, put them in the field in enough numbers, the chariots really can't do much. But the peasantry, as Fang notes in this following quote, won't have the luxury of obviously using chariots themselves or even the bronze weapons that the aristocrats fought with. They'll get iron weapons. As Fang says, quote, "The wide use of iron weaponry since the 5th century BC had made war economically more affordable to commoners, who by that time were largely free farmers living in new counties. And the new states were eager to move the farmers into war to overcome the enemies. Scholars have shown that the real purpose of many reforms that took place during the early warring states period was precisely to extend military service to the entire population, composed largely of small farmers." End quote. So that's really crucial, that last line there, that according to Fang, scholars have shown that the real purpose of these reforms had to do with fully mobilizing the state. And as we'll get into, technically the peasantry, they do get some benefits as a part of being brought into the state as something like a citizen, right? Prior, they were really sort of living on the outskirts of these city-states, mostly unbothered by the ruling elite. That'll change during the warring states period as a result of the necessity of mobilizing the local population for war. Lewis gets at the extension of warfare down the social ladder as well. He says, quote, "Warfare was transformed from a hallmark of the aristocracy focused on the battle for honor into a universal practice that bound men together in the new form of a state. The basis of this change was the progressive extension of military service so that what had been a privilege of the urban aristocracy became the duty of the rural peasantry. This process culminated in universal military service and the complete identification of the people with the army." End quote. Essential to my argument is the idea that with the fall of the aristocratic warrior and the emergence of the peasant warrior comes the complete change in the way warfare is conducted. And should that be any surprise, right? If the aristocrats themselves, the people who are either calling for these wars or have the most to lose by being defeated in a war, if they're not going to be the ones who are actually out there fighting, why are we surprised that they're willing to push these peasant armies, to the limit in terms of like death tolls that they're able to sustain? As I mentioned earlier, we see these changes come about right during the time that Sun Tzu is writing his famous work, The Art of War. And I think, you know, contrasting Sun Tzu's work with what we discussed about the norms of the spring and autumn period style of warfare gets at what I'm talking about here with, how warfare had fundamentally moved away from this honor-bound, ritualized form. For example, there's Sun Tzu's dictum that, quote, all warfare is based on deception. Certainly that would have been thought of as dishonorable during the previous spring and autumn period. Sun Tzu says that, instead of striking an enemy at its strongest point, he teaches that you evade the strong enemy and attack, quote, when the enemy is unprepared. Also, the spot where you want to fight should not sort of be telegraphed. You should keep that private. Also, completely the opposite of what the spring and autumn aristocrat warriors were into. The peasants really got a form of warfare that's much different from what the spring and autumn aristocrats were used to. Simultaneously with this, as Lewis points out, there were basically statewide censuses done during this shift that were designed to, allow the local rulers to get a handle on how many people are available to put into my military, how many people can I tax in order to fund my military. Those are sort of the immediate reasons for, conducting these censuses. Now, along with taxation comes at least one benefit, ostensibly on paper, for the peasants. Once they began paying taxes regularly to the local lord, that was, at least according to Su, the historian, the sort of social historian I mentioned earlier, he says that, quote, it amounted to a tacit recognition that the farmer was entitled to the use of a particular piece of land, or in other words, it was entitled to ownership or at least tenure in that land. So there at least is the idea that the peasant during this time period is enjoying some elevated right to their land above what they had earlier, and that comes about because they're being taxed. That almost taxing this person for using this land is a tacit acknowledgement that they own it to some degree. That last piece of that last detail there, that taxation is going to come alongside mobilization, is something we're going to see all over the place. We'll definitely see it probably in a future video I want to do on Greece, and it comes up here in the Warring States period in China. There's this inevitable extension of military participation down the social ladder that coincides with further taxation in order to fund this newly enlarged peasant army, if you will. But my argument is that the trade-off for the masses is not worth it. This sort of acknowledgement that you are a citizen, it comes along with this elevated responsibility and a duty to participate in a newly hellish form of warfare, one that is definitely not restrained by the codes of honor that the aristocrats used in the previous era. And interestingly, even the rituals that the Chinese aristocrats had used, they hadn't been completely, put aside, but they've changed in some notable ways. So, of course, the peasants hadn't earned the right to give presents to the local altars in a religious ceremony before battle. Instead, during this period, there were sort of public rituals which served, at least according to Lewis, served as, quote, covenants between the rulers and the collective citizenry. During this shift from the aristocratic to what I'm going to call egalitarian warfare, so, it almost seems like where Lewis points out this new ritual that is really a covenant between the rulers and the masses, it's almost like the aristocracy is taking the covenant that existed between the aristocrat and his ancestors and transposing that onto the population and the masses. Only the aristocrat himself will serve in the place of the ancestor, right? The aristocrat is the one now being served by the masses the same way the ancestors used to be served by the aristocrats during the spring and autumn period. Now, maybe just to insert something here, as one state or a couple states begin to arm the masses, this sort of naturally compels all the neighboring states to do so as well. This is something noted by, um, I think Ted Kaczynski notes something like this, that, if you have population A and population B, if population A decides to up its technology production and use it in warfare, well, technology B can't just remain in the Dark Ages if it wants to survive and not be dominated by A. And that's sort of what happens here. As one ruler decides to arm the peasantry, all the others are forced to do so as well in order to keep up, their station. And, as you get the neighboring feudal lords arming their peasants, in response, the states or the feudal lords that originally armed their peasants are going to just reach further and further out into the rural peasantry in order to totalize, their ability to mobilize the population for war. So during the Warring States period, that's basically what happens. You get this tit for tat back and forth where all of these lords are reaching out, extending their hand into the rural areas and transforming themselves from something more like city-states to states proper, right? Where there is a city focus or sort of a center of attention and political authority, but the masses of peasantry that surround the cities are being brought into the fold, right? They're being taxed, they're being armed. We also get some evidence that around the same time, there's more focus on improving the irrigation systems that the peasantry have access to, sort of, creating some kind of sewage system. And all of this leads to the formation of something like a bureaucracy, or at least a more extensive and intrusive bureaucracy than the types that existed during the spring and autumn period. So it's no surprise that fairly early in the spring and autumn period, you get a figure like Shang Yang. Now, he's a pretty famous figure from ancient Chinese history because he comes from the legalist school of thought. And he is somebody who sort of masters the art of bureaucracy. Not only does he find himself ascending the ranks of the bureaucracy in the Qin state himself, he actually pretty much fills it out. Once he gets to the top of this Qin state, he makes the bureaucracy total. And we'll get into that now. So Shang Yang was born in 390 BC. He becomes a chief advisor and then military advisor in the Qin state. He was instrumental in reforming the military by, arming the peasantry and organizing the peasantry, and then centralizing the state government in such a way that they could extract taxes and mobilize their citizenry quite effectively. And his reforms had a lot to do with emphasizing meritocracy rather than the kinshiped nepotistic networks that existed during the more feudal spring and autumn period, where everything was based on not just ancestors, but living relatives, and rulership was passed along hereditary lines. So Shang Yang had a lot to do with diminishing and then nearly eliminating those kinship networks in favor of this totalizing meritocratic bureaucracy. Now, Shang is probably best known, as I said earlier, for being one of the foundational thinkers in the school of legalism. Now, before we describe what kinds of changes Shang Yang and the legalists brought to the Qin state, let's remember that some of the changes experienced by the average Chinese peasant during this time, who were, the peasants were the overwhelming majority of the population of the state of this era. So during the spring and autumn period, the peasant had few actual rights, but he was free from harsh taxation, totally free from the battlefield, and was sort of left to his own devices. Sure, he did not have any of the help that would later come during the Warring States period for maybe irrigating his fields, didn't have maybe any of the prestige that would come with Shang Yang's reforms or the Warring States bureaucracies, right? Once you get a bureaucracy, you kind of need to have something like a meritocracy, right? So that would give the peasant a way up the ladder. But during the spring and autumn period, the peasants were mostly left to their own devices. Now, once they are thrown into the maw of ancient Chinese peasant warfare during the Warring States period, ostensibly they gain some ownership of their land and they do get access to sewage removal, or at least help with containing sewage and stuff like that, and creating more efficient irrigation. So you'd think that this is a bit of a trade-off. You get some acknowledgement as a citizen, but with that acknowledgement comes the duty to, protect the state. But as we'll see, I think the Shangyang legalist reforms are sort of the inevitable conclusion when a state begins mobilizing the entire population for war. Those sort of new rights and the new recognition that the Chinese peasant got at the beginning of the Warring States period is completely overcome by the states reaching for power anywhere it can find it and mobilizing the society to either retain or grow that power. So I'll just quote from an ancient Chinese text that Lewis has translated in his book that talks about Shangyang. Lewis's work says the following of Shangyang, quote, "He commanded that the people be divided into tens and fives and that they supervise each other and be mutually liable. Anyone who failed to report criminal activity would be chopped in two at the waist, while those who reported it would receive the same reward as that for obtaining the head of an enemy. Anyone who actively hit a criminal would be treated the same as one who surrendered to an enemy, executed, and all property confiscated. Any family that had 2 adult males who did not divide the household would pay double military tax." And he continues, "Those who had achievements in the army would in proportion receive an increased rank. Those who engaged in private quarrels would be punished with a severity in accord with the gravity of their quarrel. Those who devoted themselves to the fundamental enterprises through their farming and weaving and contributed much grain and cloth would be remitted from taxes, while those who worked for peripheral profits in trade and crafts and those who were idle or poor would be confiscated as slaves. Those in the royal family who had no military merit would not be listed in the registers of royal relatives." And then a bit later on, he concludes, "He commanded that among the people, fathers, sons, and siblings should not rest together in the same house." End quote. Lewis makes sure to emphasize that the enforced communal surveillance also helped ensure that military recruiting went very smoothly and that no one slipped through any administrative cracks. Lewis also states that Shang imposed a grid-like, sort of land allotment structure on the peasantry, and that there's still evidence for this grid-like structure in northern China. Lewis also went on to state, quote, "This reshaping of the countryside was an integral part to the extension of military service and the attempt to identify the social order with the army. By dividing the land into equal blocks, he was able to allocate to each family sufficient land to be worked by a single adult male. In this way, the state could obtain the maximum amount of land in cultivation and the highest possible number of adult males liable for military service and taxes." End quote. So, these changes in society and in the military and the emphasis on merit, as was sort of hinted at in the previous passages, all of this really tore down the kinship aristocracy that existed during the spring and autumn period. All of this bureaucratic growth, the emphasis on merit, it disenfranchised the lords who ruled and fought during the spring and autumn period. And we might think, well, good, hereditary lordships are ineffective or crude. But I think we, again, should take a step back to think about what this means for the average Chinese person during the spring and autumn and Warring States periods. During the spring and autumn, essentially left alone, at the beginning of the Warring States, when the peasantry is thought to provide this new usefulness in warfare, they get some rights, they get some, infrastructure development, but eventually the logic of the total state kicks in and the compulsion towards power, right? Something that in de Jovenel's work is obvious, that states exist to grab power, hold on to it, and then to continue to reach out for more, right? It's sort of the inevitable nature of institutions like a state. or maybe any institution really. All of that, the logic of that crushes the peasants by the time of Shang Yang, where basically all of their rights are gone. Their entire focus is towards the state, towards warfare, and the blade and the violence of the state is totally out of proportion with any benefit that they're getting in return for their participation in the state, right? For the first real, in any real way for the first time. The average peasant is really under Shang transformed into an instrument of the state. Their entire existence is based on providing for the state so that the state can put that same person onto a battlefield to fight for the power, ostensibly of, I guess, the state, but really the upper echelons of the bureaucracy who benefit from, spreading their power through conquest, a conquest that they don't have to participate in, and that is conducted along much different lines than in the spring and autumn period, right? You get the campaigns that are extended and are fought on, the terms that Sun Tzu lays out, right? Where honor is really taken out of the game, and it's all about winning and outlasting the enemy. This is what the peasant got in return for their so-called recognition as people from the state.